Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating demographic puzzle straight from the latest official Vatican statistics. When you look at the data from the Pontifical Yearbook 2025, it paints a very clear, kind of wild picture of both incredible hope and, frankly, urgent concern for the Catholic Church. We're going to explore a core paradox sitting right at the center of this new data. Basically, we've got a booming global Catholic population that's directly clashing with a shrinking number of priests. It's a massive structural tension affecting millions of the faithful worldwide. So to really get a grip on it, we've got to look closely at the numbers.
Seriously, how can a global institution experience immense population growth and a critical leadership shortage at the exact same time? It's a staggering contradiction, right? Usually, when any organization grows, its leadership and infrastructure grow right along with it to support the expansion. But the data shows us the Catholic Church is currently experiencing the exact opposite. Throughout this explainer, we're just going to let the data tell the story of how this mathematical reality is actually playing out on a global scale.
Section 1. A growing global flock. Okay, let's dive into this.
The global Catholic population has surged to a massive 1.406 billion people. And this isn't a stagnant number either. The Vatican data points out that the Church is seeing steady, continuous increases. But what's absolutely crucial to note about this 1.4 billion figure is where that growth is actually happening. It's being driven specifically and intensely by regions like Africa and Asia. So the global footprint of the faith is expanding like crazy, creating this massive, growing flock that obviously requires pastoral care and leadership.
Section 2. The shrinking priesthood. Let's move to Andes and see how this builds. So contrast that 1.4 billion figure with this one. The total number of Catholic priests worldwide has actually declined to 406,996. In the latest year of recorded data, this represents a drop of about 0.2%. Now sure, 0.2% might sound like a tiny fraction on paper, but when you apply that to a global workforce tasked with managing well over 1 billion people, every single individual loss represents a massive, very real gap in leadership. And this brilliantly illustrates that we're not just looking at a temporary dip here. The source notes the number of seminarians continues to decrease globally, with some pretty notable drops reported in recent years. Basically, this means that 0.2% drop in ordained priests is part of a much larger long-term vocation crisis. The pipeline for future leadership is shrinking right alongside the current workforce. So the crucial point is really just right here in the math. When you take a rapidly growing population of 1.4 billion and divide it by a shrinking workforce of roughly 406,000, that ratio is going to keep rising. The data shows us it frequently hits one priest for every 3,000 to 3,500 faithful, and honestly, in some regions, that number is way higher. To put that into perspective, the tangible, on-the-ground result of this mathematical strain is profound. We're literally talking about thousands of parishes around the world today that no longer have a resident priest. Entire communities are just left without dedicated, localized pastoral care.
Section 3. A global geographic shift.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast between different hemispheres. It's like two totally different worlds. In Europe and parts of the West, the shortage of priests is acute. We're talking aging clergy, fewer ordinations, and a system that's just fundamentally straining to provide care. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, Africa and Asia are experiencing this incredibly vibrant growth in vocations. In fact, the growth is so strong, it really brings a sense of hope to the data. It's gotten to the point where Africa and Asia are now actually exporting missionaries to serve in other parts of the world, very often filling the gaps left behind in the West.
Section 4. The spiritual stakes.
So why does all this matter so deeply to the Catholic Church? Well, we really have to look at the spiritual stakes here. According to the source, priests bring the faithful the sacraments, which the Church considers to be the absolute lifeblood of the faith. And here's the kicker. These sacraments, specifically the Eucharist and reconciliation, they strictly require an ordained priest to be administered. Therefore, a lack of localized priests directly threatens the ability of everyday Catholics to actually access the core spiritual practices that define their religious life. Put simply, without the personnel on the ground, that spiritual lifeblood is severely restricted.
Section 5. The call for laborers. So how does the Church respond to this? Well, the source actually frames this modern statistical decline through a very direct biblical lens. It quotes Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew, saying, "The harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. So ask the master of the harvest to send out laborers for his harvest." So the data, the 1.4 billion faithful representing that abundant harvest, and the declining 406,000 priests representing the few laborers,
It's viewed by the source almost as a direct modern parallel of this passage. The text uses the scripture as a major spiritual call to action for the entire church. And that call to action, it takes a very specific intercessory form. The text actually outlines 3 spiritual steps to combat the crisis. First, the church as a whole must collectively acknowledge this severe need for laborers. Second, the faithful are instructed to entrust the need to Our Lady, Mary, as the mother of the church. And third, they are asked to seek the intercession of Saint John Vianney, who happens to be the patron saint of priests, along with all holy priests and saints. So, the official response to a stark mathematical crisis of personnel is fundamentally a unified turn toward prayer and divine intercession.
Which brings us to a final, lingering question. We've seen the data, right? We know the 1.4 billion population is growing, heavily driven by the global south. And we know the priesthood is shrinking, putting massive strain on the pastoral care of thousands of parishes, especially in the West. So, as the global map of Catholicism fundamentally shifts right beneath our feet, how will the church sustain its flock long-term? Will the vibrant growth in Africa and Asia be enough to carry this global institution into the future? Or will this crazy paradox of growth and decline eventually require a completely new approach to leadership? It's a huge question, and for sure, it's one that will undoubtedly define the next century of this ancient institution.